This is a tale in which one's own blood is a defense and an offensive. In the place of your family name being feared, but you use it to save lives and not to ruin them. It is an incredible tale of Albert Göring, the little-known brother of Hermann Göring, the most notorious executioner of Hitler. One came to power full of brutality, whereas Albert even risked his life in order to resist the Nazi regime. We find some lost history of daring and silent resistance. We shall enter into the history books with us as we unfold the man who fought against his own blood. It's January 30th, 1933. Germany was in crossroads, but not many people could understand the scale of the events which were going to take place that day. The frailty of the democratic system of the country gave way under the pressure of ambition and hate. Adolf Hitler came to power, and he started a new order, which was not founded on freedom or justice, but on fear. And the old vivacious discussions of the Republic melted away in silence. Censorship and suspicion had entered in all the corners of life, and those who already had spoken openly only yesterday now lowered their voices, worried who might be listening. Life had become full of anxiety as the Nazi regime became more and more tyrannical. The avenues, which had been full of sport and motion, were still under the scrutiny of uniformed men. The fear has substituted the trust. Patriotism towards the state replaced the patriotism towards the human race. Propaganda inundated the homes, classes, and minds to turn the truth into weaponized lies. Neighbors became enemies of neighbors. The mistrust became the survival, and the machine of tyranny became even more powerful. In Europe, the shade of this new force was extended over the world, and it swallowed both nations and consciences. In the gloom of this blackness, resistance became almost impossible, a rarity. The majority were submitting to the pressure, either because they were afraid, or because they believed in what the regime was saying. They believed them. But still, there were some who would not give in. Albert Göring was one of them. A name which history may well have had a hand in besmirching by association, the son of one of the masterminds of terror in the regime. He could easily live a life of privilege and quiet, but rather his conscience made him walk the way of silent resistance, a dangerous position against all that the world his brother inhabited symbolized. Not determined or dramatic, but potent and natural, Albert had done what was right at a time when morality was a life-threatening issue. He also stretched out where no one could, had provided refuge where others had distrusted him, and in the act shouldered the burden of a name by which he had become identified, namely as some body of fear, only to render it, in any rate, to some extent, redemption. Albert was born on March 9, 1895, in the small layback town of Friedenau, where cobblestone streets stretched the sound of the old days. He was born fifth of 10 children in a family that was unified by the dictates, but terribly torn by the beliefs. His family belonged to a narrow border of understanding. His mother, a kindly Bavarian female whose presence invited people. His father, a rough Prussian official whose traditions, order, and inexorable sense of duty made him up. The two worlds between them were the tension between the world of empathy and that of discipline. Into this air of inconsistency Albert entered, made by love and by the tint of anticipation. Another character whose influence penetrated far into his boyhood was his godfather Hermann Eppenstein, a Jewish physician of remarkable intelligence and silent power. Eppenstein, in his turn, represented a sort of cool wisdom, which made no trace in young Albert. He led by example and not by dictate, and that is what gave him a perspective of the world not with authority, but with insight. But there was some cloud of speculation in the presence of Eppenstein, some whisper of a possibility that Albert might have been bound to him more than by any special godfatherly relationship. A piece of secret fact that ran in the strands of his ancestry. Where his elder brother Hermann was growing to the martialism of the time and its loudness, Albert pursued a more tranquil course. Where Hermann was to glory in orders, uniforms, Albert in observation, thought and reflection. He was examining the world in a new perspective, and not in the small perspective of conquest, but in the broad perspective of human feeling. His kindly demeanor and simple-minded inquisitiveness distinguished him even in his own house. When years had passed and the ideological hurricane started rolling throughout Germany, the type of Albert became was a silent protest. He was compassionate and inclusive in a society that celebrated violence and innocence. His modesty, consideration, and moral bravery caused him to be all the Nazi regime hated, and evidence that decency and conscience could even survive in an era dominated by power. The bloodshed of 1914 was calling, and Albert was responding to it, though not as a fighter pilot like his brother Hermann, but as a communications engineer who was buried in the mud of the Western Front. And as Hermann was flying through the skies in search of glory, Albert was working down there in the midst of the axe of the gunfire and the never-muting beat of death and life. He labored to keep loose threads of communication running through bombardments that ripped earth and men to tatters. And he was a silent keeper of order in a world falling into madness. The war made its marks on him in the ways which no one could observe. His physical injuries were to take months in a hospital before they mended, but the more lasting injuries were inward, a silence that was at a heavy price and which attended him home long after the guns had died down. He had seen enough, the squandering of youth, the meaninglessness of empire, the empty shouts of triumph made by those who did not know what it was to live and die. Albert was no longer the man who had led his march to war in 1914 when peace finally came. The belief in authority that he had had in the front had been shattered in blind obedience. During the succeeding years, when Hermann was advancing within the ranks of a new dark movement, the course taken by Albert changed significantly. His ambition to be a leader was not to be prominent, but to escape the shadow of his brother, who was rising in the political whirlwind that took place in Germany. By 1933, he was established in Vienna, a city that was boiling beneath the skin with discomposure, its cafes and streets buzzing with apprehension and insurrection with equal sound. It was there that he could observe the extension of the shadow and the promise of democracy being replaced by the imminent danger of fascism. Albert did not want to give in to the tide. He rejected the Nazi Party when it was gaining strength across borders and infiltrating into the smallest spheres of the life of the Austrians. He tried to escape into identity and principle, and applied to be a citizen of Austria, and disassociated himself with the Reich his brother had become to represent. In silence, he started to develop little gestures of resistance, whispered conversations, gestures of resistance which were no less heroic because kept secret. Albert had a theme in that silent protest, as lasting as the notoriety of his brother. It started so soft, so hardly noticeable. One act of kindness in the face of an uprising tempest. Henny Porten, who used to be a revered actress, received her voice suppressed and her career under Nazi persecution. It was then that Albert came forward and gave her a lifeline where few dared. He got her a contract where she was able to work again, save not only her life, but art and humanity she represented. His interventions during those early days were small. They seemed almost administrative, but with the passive rebellion of a man who did not want to submit to cruelty. His reputation increased with every word of what he was doing. The name of Albert started to roll like a terrified word in gracious fear. Ironically, it is that power which was intertwined with the name which became the protection of the people who occupied the verge of destruction in the Nazi establishment. His safeguard was not limited to bureaucracy alone, but it was a question of life and death. In every signature or favor, there was the moral insurrection, a revolt against the clockwork which was trying to blot out whole communities. When 1938 came and Austria became in the shade of annexation of Germany, the silent opposition of Albert turned into the brave stand. Safety limits no longer existed, and it was conviction alone that would direct his decision. His activities to house Jewish friends became more active, and one of the men whom he assisted was Oskar Pilzer, who was the victim of his own ancestry and fate. Albert not only took a risk to his job, but also his life, and he did it at the time when something that he did not do would have been easier and less expensive. The picture, which would have the longest lasting impact, was a result of one rebellious street scene. When a Jewish woman was made to clean the pavement in the presence of SS men, Albert intervened and replaced her and knelt next to her in the gutter. The shocked gasps of the crowd filled the crowd, including the soldiers themselves. In it, so simple, quiet, and cannot be overestimated, Albert proclaimed his loyalty to the regime of hate, but to the honor of the human spirit. It was at that point that resistance was no longer a politics issue, but it became a conscience issue. Albert was in the Škoda Works, a large and a highly strategic arms factory, and as the Nazi war machine rolled onwards, eastward, he was now in occupied Czechoslovakia. The plant was the main provider of the German army, having manufactured weapons, ammunition, and armored elements that supplied the never-ending war on the Eastern Front. In its large workshops and reverberating halls, the clink of the steel and the moaning of the heavy machines produced an air of precision and just repression. Workers toiled under the supervision of German guardians, and their work contributed to a war that appeared to have no end. In this industrial citadel of the Reich, Albert made another way. He did not visibly resist the Nazi war effort, but he quietly fought a subversion campaign, just like any other engineer did, on the outside. All days were risky, and all days were opportunities. He also took his time to study the production lines, and he found out how to sabotage their efficiency without being noticed. Rivets had been lost, there were some minor calibration mistakes, and deliveries had been postponed. It was a hidden struggle, which was waged by wits, patience, and unalterable determination. Albert was insurrectionary outside the walls of the factory. In signing the name of his brother to get prisoners liberated, he did not only commit an act of deception, but it was an act of silent heroism. He also came up with plans that saw trucks being deployed to concentration camps under a false mission, only to go off route and to leave the condemned under the thick canopy of the forests around them. These acts of freedom were very momentary, but of great weight. Everyone was a little triumph over a monstrous system. Albert made his work environment a conscience battleground through the use of minor forms of sabotage and ethical bravery. His weapons were not firearms or bombs, but humor, understanding, and a consistent and invincible obligation towards humanity. His rebellion was a voice raised in a world that was engulfed in tyranny, a voice that was a whisper when someone raised it against the Reich roar, but this voice went beyond anyone could think. By 1944, the Gestapo had tightened its eyes on Albert, and their suspicions were getting worse with every month as the Nazi regime became more desperate to eliminate anti-Semitism. His connections, which had been a source of protection, started to wear away under the stress of paranoia that engulfed Germany in its dying years. Arrest was the specter which he could no longer escape, but in a measure the power of Hermann came to his defense. A kind of hand waving in the air which kept the wolves off. Albert spent his days not knowing whether this was the day when he heard the knock on the door, man in the midst of fear and conviction. As soon as the guns dropped their fire, another form of imprisonment had commenced. Its triumph did not cause peace to his soul, nor did it relieve him of the burden of suspicion which rested on him who was in any way connected with the old regime. His name was a stain in the rubble of post-war Germany, which could not be washed away by his defense very easily. Individuals gossiped, asked questions, shunned him. To most, Albert was the gray area between the comedy and the hero, and not many were interested to unravel the distinction. The truth only started to emerge through the testimonies given by people he had helped in secret. Ex-prisoners, fugitives, and neighbors came out, and their words formed a thin veil to the storm of condemnation. They narrated about the secret rooms, the secret warnings, and the silent protests being conducted in the very view of the tyranny. Gradually, belief gave place to awareness, but by this time it was too late. His resistance had cost him the price in seclusion and obscurity. After years of fear and weariness, his wife abandoned him, and with the daughter, she started off to Peru in pursuit of peace, and the Germany was incapable of providing any more. Albert stuck to his life in Munich and spent his last years in the silent fringes of a society that had left him behind. He was an outcast, a man unknown who thought, who brooded, with the moral tincture of decisions of which he was the cause of few. Eventually, he would be soon forgotten, and only those who owed him their lives would recollect his story, and history itself would have a dim recollection of what the bravery had been like in its most lonely manifestation. The story of Albert Göring helps us not to forget that even in the most severe period of time, the light of human courage may burst out. A man whose name was as notorious as possible, but who could not be tyrant, could not be silent, must be sympathetic. Did this story touch your heart? Come with us to discover the heroes of history. Subscribe, like, and use the bell icon to find more untold stories. Since the first step to pay tribute to courage is to remember it. Thank you for watching.